He looked her up and down like a man pricing livestock, and then he said the words, "This is a mistake." Just like that. The train hadn't even finished hissing behind her. The cold was so sharp, it felt like swallowing glass, but his words were colder. She stood on the splintered platform of a town she'd never seen, in front of the man she'd crossed 2 territories to marry, and he looked at her like she was dirt on his boot. She opened her mouth, but the hope she'd carried all those miles got stuck in her throat. He saw her struggle and his lip curled. "I asked for a woman with a work ethic," he said, his voice loud enough for the 2 men leaning outside the saloon to hear. "Not one who looks like she's done the work of 10 men already." He didn't say ugly. He didn't have to. The word hung between them, thick and black as locomotive smoke. The whole town, it seemed, had stopped to watch. A face in the general store window. A curtain twitching in the boarding house. They weren't just watching, they were judging. And she knew, in that gut-wrenching way you know a bone is broken, that they had already reached their verdict. "You said you wanted grit," she managed, her voice a low rasp. The letter she held crumpled in her palm, the paper now damp with sweat despite the cold. "I wanted grit behind closed doors," he snapped. "Not wearing it on her face. I'm building a life here. I need a wife who reflects well on me, not one who looks like she wrestled a bear for her breakfast." Someone at the saloon snickered. The sound was like a whip crack. She swallowed the fire rising in her chest. "I spent everything I had to get here. On your word." He just shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture that broke something deep inside her. "That sounds like your problem, not mine." And then he turned his back. He just turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with a single suitcase, a worthless train ticket, and the weight of 100 silent stares. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury, and she'd just spent her last coin on hope. She just stood there, her hands, cracked and calloused, clenched into fists at her sides. She didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just a rejection. This was a declaration of war, and in this town, she was the only soldier on her side. She walked away from the station because standing still felt too much like dying. Every door was a new kind of silent rejection. The boarding house owner took one look at her worn boots and the defiant set of her jaw and said, "All full up." The lie was as plain as the grime on the windows. She tried the hotel above the saloon, but the man behind the bar just laughed. "We don't rent rooms by the hour to your kind." Her kind, the kind that worked, the kind that didn't hide the cost of survival. By nightfall, she was sitting behind the post office, her back pressed against the freezing brick, her arms wrapped around her knees. The last of her money, a single lonely coin, had gone to a street kid for a heel of bread so stale it scraped the roof of her mouth. She ate it slowly, forcing it down, because it was all she had. She watched her breath turn to smoke and disappear, just like her future. She thought about the man from the station, his clean coat, his smooth hands, the easy cruelty in his eyes. She'd met men like him before, men who thought the world owed them something pretty to put on their arm, men who saw strength in a woman as a flaw, not a feature. A cat slinked by, gaunt and wary. It saw her, hissed, and vanished into the shadows. Even the strays didn't want her company. She wasn't one of the soft girls, the ones with lace on their cuffs and laughter like little bells. She was a tool, built to endure, not to be admired. And for the first time, huddled in that alley with the wind biting at her bones, she wondered if that's all she'd ever be. Something to be used up and then cast aside. But as the frost began to creep into the fibers of her shawl, another feeling started to bloom in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't despair, it was rage. A cold, hard, quiet rage. He thought he could break her. The town thought they could starve her out. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She wasn't just a woman with rough hands, she was a fortress, and they had just fired the first cannonball at her walls. They were about to find out what happened when the fortress fired back. By morning, the frost had turned the tips of her hair to silver. She didn't brush it off. She wore it like a crown. She walked through the town not like a beggar, but like a surveyor. Every street, every building, every face was a piece of a puzzle she had to solve to survive. The bakery was her first stop. The smell of yeast and sugar was a sweet torture, but she didn't go there for a handout. "Need work," she said to the woman behind the counter, a sour-faced woman with flour dusting her eyebrows. The woman looked her over, her gaze lingering on her calloused hands. "We don't need bakers." "I'm not a baker," she replied, her voice steady. "I scrub." And so she scrubbed. She scrubbed floors until the lye soap ate at her skin. She scrubbed soot-blackened ovens until her arms screamed in their sockets. She scrubbed buckets and pans and the very dirt from between the floorboards. The baker's wife, Elspeth, threw orders at her like stones. The pretty girl at the counter, Rose, watched her with a mixture of pity and disgust. But she worked. She poured every ounce of her anger and fear into the rhythm of it. Scrub, rinse, repeat. It was honest. It was real. Dirt didn't lie. Dirt didn't judge. The whispers followed her. "That's the one," they'd mutter as she walked by. "The mail-order bride that wasn't good enough. Look at her, working like an animal." She heard them all, and she kept scrubbing. But then, someone else started watching. He was a rancher, they said, lived out past the ridge. He was tall and quiet, with a stillness about him that was different from the town's tense silence. He didn't gawk, he didn't whisper, he just noticed. She saw him leave a loaf of bread on the widow Jensen's porch when he thought no one was looking. She saw him gentle his horse with a touch that was firmer, but kinder than most men used with their wives. He came into the bakery for flour, and his eyes would pass over her, not with pity, but with a flicker of something she couldn't name. Acknowledgement. He saw her, not the rejected bride, not the floor scrubber. Her. One afternoon, a heavy crate of flour sacks slipped from her aching grasp. It crashed to the floor, sending a cloud of white powder billowing through the air. It looked like a ghost exploding. Elspeth shrieked. Rose giggled. Shame, hot and sharp, washed over her. But before she could even move, the quiet rancher was there. He knelt in the mess, not saying a word. He didn't scold. He didn't offer a hand. He just started lifting the heavy sacks, one by one, his movements calm and efficient. She scrambled to help, their shoulders brushing in the dusty air. When they were done, he stood, dusted off his hands, and looked at her. Really looked at her. For a long second, the noise of the bakery, the whispers of the town, all of it faded away. There was only the flour dust motes dancing in the afternoon light and the steady look in his dark eyes. Then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, tipped his hat, and walked out. She didn't thank him. The words were trapped in her throat, tangled up with an emotion so foreign she couldn't identify it. That night, as she mended her worn stockings, her hands didn't just ache from work. They tingled. It was the ghost of a feeling, the memory of a touch that never happened. A shoulder brushing hers, a shared weight. It was the smallest of things. But in a life made of nothing, it felt like everything. And she had a terrifying thought. The quiet rancher wasn't just a kind man. He was a dangerous one. Because he was the first person in this town to make her feel something other than anger. He made her feel human. Their paths kept crossing. It was strange. Almost too frequent to be a coincidence. At the town well, he'd be there, and he'd pass her the ladle first. In the general store, He'd step aside and let her go ahead in line. Small gestures, unspoken. But in a town where she was treated as less than invisible, these moments were like breaths of air to a drowning woman. She never learned his name. He never asked for hers. They were two ghosts haunting the same town, acknowledging each other with silence. But the town noticed. Oh, they always notice. She's got her sights on him now, Elspeth muttered to a customer, her voice like grinding stones. A working girl like that, and a landowner? Rose scoffed behind her hand. She's trying to trap him. Poor man's too decent to see it. The words were like frostbite, numbing her on the outside but causing a deep, burning ache within. She built her walls higher, made her expression stonier, worked until her muscles burned too much to feel anything else. Then one afternoon, the burning in her muscles was replaced by a dizzying blackness. The bakery floor tilted. The smell of sugar turned sickeningly sweet. Her knees gave out. She woke up on the back porch of the bakery, the cold evening air sharp on her cheeks. A heavy wool coat, not her own, was draped over her. And sitting on the porch rail, whittling a piece of wood with a small, sharp knife, was the quiet rancher. He didn't look at her at first. He just kept his eyes on the horizon, on the purple and orange streaks of the dying sun. "You fainted," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Could have cracked your head open." She pushed herself up, her head throbbing. The coat smelled of cedar and leather and cold air. "Water's there," he said, nodding toward a canteen on the step beside her. "I'll walk you to your place when you're ready." He didn't know she didn't have a place. He didn't know she slept in an alley. The shame of it was a physical weight. She drank the water, the coolness soothing her raw throat. She tried to form the words to thank him, but they wouldn't come. What came out instead was a dry, broken sob. Just one. She cut it off instantly, her back rigid with humiliation. She never cried. Never. He stopped whittling. He didn't say, "Don't cry." He didn't say, "It'll be all right." He just sat there in the growing twilight, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he slid off the rail and stood before her. He held out his hand. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It felt like an offer, a simple, straightforward transaction. She stared at his hand. It was large, calloused like her own, but the lines were different. This was a hand that built things, that guided life from the earth. She put her hand in his. His grip was warm and firm. It wasn't gentle. It was solid. It felt like an anchor. The town's whispers grew into a roar in the following days. They said she'd planned it, said she'd thrown herself at his feet to bewitch him. A woman like her, they hissed, using the only currency she had. But she didn't care. She heard every word, and for the first time, it didn't pierce her armor. It glanced right off, because one man hadn't looked away when she was at her weakest. One man had offered a hand not to save her, but to steady her. The next morning, sweeping the bakery stoop, she found a small sprig of wintergreen, the kind that only grew up on the high ridges, tucked beside the step. No note, no ribbon, just a piece of the wild, stubborn world he came from. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that their paths weren't crossing by accident. This quiet, steady rancher was watching her for a reason, and she had no idea if he was her salvation, or a different kind of ruin altogether. The snow came early, blanketing the town in a deceptive softness. It covered the mud and the grime, but it couldn't cover the ugliness of the people. She moved through the white landscape like a shadow, head down, work to be done. The whispers continued, a constant nagging chorus. Still here, is she? He must be paying her for favors. The rancher didn't speak of the rumors. He didn't need to. His actions spoke a different language. One morning, a small stack of perfectly cut firewood appeared outside the alley she called home. Another day, a thick pair of wool socks, slightly worn but clean and mended, was left on the bakery's back step. Gifts of survival, not charity, not courtship. They felt like supplies, like he was equipping a soldier. But why? The question haunted her. This man, a respected landowner, was risking his reputation for the town's pariah. There had to be a reason. One afternoon, he walked into the bakery. He bypassed the counter, ignored Elspeth's suspicious glare, and walked straight to where she was scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees. "You know how to fix a broken water pump?" he asked, his voice low. She looked up, startled. Water dripped from a strand of her hair onto the floor. "I've mended one before." "Mine's seized up," he said. "I'll pay you for your time." It wasn't a request. It was a job offer. A test. She followed him out of the bakery, leaving Elspeth sputtering in her wake. His ranch was a world away from the cramped, judgmental town. The land was wide and stark and beautiful. The house was small and practical, built to withstand the wind, not to impress visitors. She liked it immediately. He led her to the pump, handed her a box of tools, and then he stepped back. He didn't hover. He didn't instruct. He just watched. She worked in silence, her hands remembering the cold, stubborn logic of metal and mechanics. It was a language she understood better than people. "Not many women know their way around a wrench," he said after a long while. "Most women aren't given the chance," she replied, not looking up from her work. She felt his gaze on her, steady and assessing. It took her 2 hours, but she fixed it. When the water finally gushed from the spout, clean and cold, a surge of pride, fierce and unfamiliar, washed through her. He nodded slowly, his eyes on the flowing water. "The man at the station," he said, and her blood ran cold. "The one who was supposed to meet you. His name is Caldwell, Elias Caldwell." She froze, her hand still on the pump handle. "His father owns the bank," the rancher continued, his voice flat, emotionless. "He owns most of the mortgages in this town, including the one on this ranch." And just like that, the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't about kindness. This wasn't about pity. This was about an enemy. "Caldwell's been trying to push me out for years," he said, finally looking at her. There was a hard, dangerous light in his eyes. "He wants this water. He's been damming up the creek downstream, trying to dry me out. A broken pump in the dead of winter. That would have finished me." She stared at him, her mind reeling. The firewood, the socks, fixing the pump. He wasn't helping her. He was hiring her. He saw her strength, her resilience, the very things Caldwell had despised, and he recognized them as weapons. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, and the sheer size of him, the quiet power he radiated, was overwhelming. "Caldwell cast you aside because he thinks you're worthless. He underestimates you. People like him, they always underestimate the ones who know how to survive." He paused, his gaze intense. "I don't want to hire you to scrub my floors. I want to hire you to help me fight." The air crackled with tension. This was a declaration, an alliance forged in mutual desperation. He was offering her a new purpose, not just to survive, but to get even. She looked from his hard, determined face to the vast, unforgiving land around them. She had come to this town to be a wife. She had been cast out as a beggar. Now, she was being offered the chance to be a weapon. And the thought of aiming that weapon directly at the man who had tried to destroy her was the most tempting thing she had ever known. She didn't say yes right away. She just nodded, a single sharp dip of her chin. It was enough. A new rhythm began. It wasn't courtship. It was a conspiracy. She still scrubbed floors at the bakery, a perfect listening post, but her afternoons were spent at his ranch. His name, she learned, was Silas. He taught her the land, not the pretty parts, but the strategic ones. The low points where water pooled, the game trails that made for secret paths, the rocky outcrops that offered a clear view of the Caldwell property that bordered his. And she, in turn, showed him her own skills. She wasn't just a scrubber. She could patch a roof so it would withstand a blizzard. She could set a fence post as true as any man. She could strip and clean a rifle in the dark. These were the things her hard life had taught her, the bitter lessons she'd never had a name for. Silas called it tactical. He never touched her. The space between them was charged with unspoken things, but it remained professional. A partnership. He paid her a fair wage, coins that clinked into the tin box she kept hidden in the alley. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was building an arsenal. One evening, while she was reinforcing a weak spot in his barn wall, she found it. Tucked behind a loose board was a small, leather-bound journal. It was Silas's. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The entries were sparse, written in a heavy, deliberate script. October 10th. Caldwell's men ran 3 of my steers off the South Ridge. October 18th. The creek is lower than I've ever seen it. His new dam is working. November 3rd. Found the fence cut again. He's testing me. But then, she saw an entry that made her heart stop. November 12th. A woman arrived for Elias Caldwell today. He turned her away at the station. I saw her face. It was the same face my wife had the day she gave up. I will not let Caldwell do that to another person. I will not let him win. His wife. The word echoed in the dusty barn. He'd had a wife. And something about her public humiliation, had struck a chord deep inside him. This wasn't just about water rights and land. This was personal. Deeply, painfully personal. She put the journal back, her hands shaking. She felt like an intruder, but also like she finally understood. His quietness wasn't just a personality trait. It was a wall built around a wound. The next day, she worked with a renewed ferocity. They were fortifying the northern fence line when she saw him watching her hands. Yours were tearing, he said gruffly, and tossed a pair of sturdy leather gloves at her feet. They weren't new, but they were clean, and the palms had been reinforced with a second layer of hide. She picked them up. The leather was supple. Someone had worked oil into it to keep it from cracking. Him. Thank you, she said, her voice thick. Can't have my best field hand getting splinters, he replied, turning away to hide the flicker of emotion in his eyes. My best field hand. Not a stray, not a charity case, a valued part of the operation. The town's annual winter dance was approaching. A bitter joke of a celebration in a town full of hard people. She had no intention of going, but the morning of the dance, a small wrapped parcel was waiting for her on the bakery step. Inside was a simple, dark blue ribbon for her hair. The note had only 2 words: be seen. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command, a strategic move. Caldwell would be there. The whole town would be there. This was their chance to make a statement, to show they were not hiding, to show they were a unified front. That night she walked into the church hall, and a hush fell over the room. She wore her same plain skirt, her same worn boots. But her head was held high, and the blue ribbon was a slash of defiance in her hair. Elias Caldwell was there, holding court by the punch bowl, his slicked back hair gleaming in the lantern light. His eyes widened when he saw her, a flicker of disbelief followed by a sneer. And then Silas was crossing the room. He didn't hesitate. He walked right up to her, ignored the whispers and the stares, and held out his hand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. She placed her hand in his. His grip was solid. an anchor in a sea of hostility. He led her to the center of the floor, and they began to move. They didn't dance well. They were two broken, practical people trying to perform an act of grace. But they moved together, one slow, swaying step at a time. It wasn't a dance, it was a challenge. Caldwell watched them, his face a mask of fury. This was his town, his party. And this quiet rancher and the woman he'd thrown away were claiming the center of it. After the dance, Silas walked her back towards the alley. The snow was falling, thick and silent. "You were brave tonight," he said. "I was following orders," she replied. He stopped, turning to face her in the swirling snow. "It was more than that. You stood your ground." "I'm tired of being ashamed," she whispered, the words tasting strange on her tongue. He just nodded, understanding passing between them, without the need for more words. But as she turned to go, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Elias Caldwell. His face was twisted with rage. "This is a mistake, Silas," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. "Her, you, this little display of yours." Silas moved, placing himself between her and Caldwell. "Go home, Elias." "She's nothing, a piece of trash I wisely refused to pick up," Caldwell spat, his eyes fixed on her. "And you'll regret this. You and your failing ranch will be dust by spring, I promise you that." The threat hung in the frozen air, ugly and real. She looked at Caldwell's hateful face, then at Silas's rigid back. She had wanted to be a weapon. Now she was standing on the battlefield, and the first shot had just been fired directly at them. The threat wasn't idle. The very next week, things escalated. The sheriff, a man whose pockets were lined so heavily with Caldwell money he practically jingled when he walked, paid Silas a visit. He had a freshly signed complaint. Silas's fences, he claimed, were encroaching on Caldwell land. A blatant lie, but one with the weight of the law behind it. "You've got 30 days to move the line, or we'll move it for you," the sheriff said, not quite meeting Silas's eyes. "This fence has been here for 50 years, Silas stated, his voice dangerously calm. "Times change," the sheriff grunted, and left. It was a siege. Caldwell wasn't just trying to dry him out anymore. He was trying to choke him out, to steal his land piece by legal piece. She and Silas worked from dawn until dusk. They pored over his father's old maps and property deeds, searching for any loophole, any scrap of evidence to fight back. The journal she'd found was their guide. Every act of sabotage Caldwell had committed was documented. A cut fence here, a spooked herd there. It was a pattern of harassment. "It's not enough," Silas said one night, his head in his hands. "It's his word against mine. And in this town, his word is gospel." They were losing. She could feel the hope seeping out of him, replaced by a weary resignation. The same resignation she'd seen in the mirror every morning for years. And that made her angry. She wouldn't let him give up. She wouldn't let Caldwell win. Not again. "There's something we're missing," she insisted, her finger tracing the faded property lines on the map. "A lie this big has to have a weak spot." Her chance to find it came from an unexpected place. Rose, the pretty girl from the bakery, had always been Elias Caldwell's girl. She simpered and flirted whenever he came in. But lately, a new girl, the banker's niece from out of town, had caught his eye. Rose was pushed aside, and her vanity turned to venom. One afternoon, while sweeping, she heard Rose complaining to Elspeth. "He thinks he's so high and mighty," Rose sniffed, bragging about the Caldwell legacy and how his grandfather practically built this town from nothing. "Said the original deed to all this land is framed on his office wall, the very first one." The words hit her like a lightning bolt. The very first one. That night, she told Silas. "His pride," she said, her voice urgent. "That's his weak spot. He's so proud of his family's history, he puts the proof on the wall for everyone to see. Silas looked at her, a new spark in his tired eyes. But how do we get to it? He's hosting a party, she said. She'd heard Rose talking about it, a big affair for the banker's niece. The whole town will be there, the house will be full, but his office might be empty. It was a crazy risk. If she was caught, it wouldn't just be a complaint, it would be jail. I'll do it, she said, before he could object. No one will suspect me. They all think I'm just the help. They won't even see me. His face was a storm of conflict. He didn't want to let her go. But he knew she was right. She was their only chance. 2 nights later, she slipped through the back gardens of the Caldwell mansion. She wore a dark dress she'd bought with her own money, her hair tucked under a simple cap. She looked like one of the hired servers. And just as she'd predicted, no one gave her a second glance. She found the office. It was opulent, filled with dark wood and the smell of cigar smoke. And there, on the wall, was a large ornate frame. Inside was a yellowed piece of parchment, the original town charter and land grant. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted the heavy frame off the wall. She carefully worked the back off and slid the old document out. Her hands, so used to rough work, were surprisingly nimble. She scanned the document. The lines were drawn in faded ink, the signatures ornate swirls. It all looked official. Her heart sank. Had she been wrong? But then she saw it. At the very bottom, below the official seals and signatures, was a small, almost invisible watermark embedded in the paper itself. It wasn't a crest. It was a maker's mark, a paper mill. St. Louis Paper Company, Edemy, 1875. She stared at the date, her blood turning to ice. The land grant was dated 1868. The paper it was written on hadn't existed until 7 years later. It was a forgery, a brilliant, audacious, 50-year-old lie. The entire Caldwell legacy, their wealth, their power, was built on a piece of fake paper. She was holding the truth in her hands. A truth that could either set them free or get them both killed. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. She had to get out. Now. She moved on pure instinct. The deed slid back into the frame back on the wall, just as the doorknob began to turn. She didn't have time for the door. She dove behind the heavy velvet curtains that covered the window, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. The door opened. It was Elias Caldwell and his father. "A fine party, son," the old man said, his voice thick with whiskey and self-satisfaction. "The girl seems properly impressed." "She understands the importance of family, of legacy," Elias replied. He walked over to the desk, his back to her hiding place. "Something that fool Silas will never understand. His family had their chance at this land. They were too weak to hold it." Old man Caldwell chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Weakness is a sin, my boy. Remember that. We took what was ours by right of strength. The law, the paper. That's just a story we tell the sheep to keep them in line." He tapped the frame on the wall, the very frame she had just touched. "And this," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is the greatest story ever told." They laughed together, and the sound made her sick. She stayed frozen, barely breathing, until they left the room. She waited another 5 minutes that felt like 5 years, then slipped out the window and ran. She didn't stop running until she saw the single lantern glowing in Silas's window. She burst into his cabin, breathless, clutching the small piece of paper on which she had frantically copied the watermark and the dates. She didn't need to say a word. The look on her face said it all. He took the paper from her trembling hand. He stared at it, his knuckles white. The color drained from his face. For a full minute he was silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire. "My grandfather," he finally said, his voice choked with emotion. "He always said the Caldwells swindled him, said they came with a fancy deed from the capital and forced him off the best part of his land. No one believed him. They called him a sore loser, a drunk." He looked up at her, and his eyes were shining with a terrible, vindictive light. "They didn't just steal his land. They stole his name, his honor." This was it, the weak spot she'd been looking for, the crack in the foundation of the Caldwell empire. But what could they do? It was still their word against the most powerful family in the territory. A 50-year-old forgery was hard to prove. "We need more than this," Silas said, his voice low and hard as granite. "We need the original survey maps, the ones from before the grant. My grandfather must have kept them." They spent the next 2 days tearing the old ranch house apart. They searched the attic, the cellar, every trunk and drawer. Nothing. Hope began to dwindle again. It felt like they had the key but couldn't find the lock. On the 3rd day, she was in the barn, staring at the wall she had been mending weeks ago. The wall where she'd found Silas's journal. A thought struck her. A wall was a good place to hide things. She grabbed a crowbar. Silas joined her, his eyes questioning. "You hide things where you can see them every day," she said, "so you don't forget." She pried at the loose board. It came away with a groan of old nails. And behind it, in a hollowed-out space, was a long tin cylinder, sealed with wax. Silas took it from her, his hands unsteady. He broke the seal. Inside, rolled tightly, was a sheaf of brittle, yellowed papers. He unrolled the first one on the table. It was the original survey map from 1865, and it showed, clear as day, that the land the Caldwell house stood on, the land the bank occupied, the very heart of the town they controlled, had all belonged to Silas's grandfather. But that wasn't the biggest shock. Tucked in with the maps was another document, a bill of sale. It was for a small, adjoining parcel of land sold by Silas's grandfather to a new settler. The signature of the witness on that legitimate bill of sale was clear. It was a perfect match for the signature on the forged land grant. Old man Caldwell hadn't just faked a document. He had traced the signature of a real witness from a real sale to make his forgery look legitimate. And they now had both documents, the lie and the truth it was copied from. They had him. They had everything. The next morning, they didn't go to the sheriff. They didn't go to the bank. They went to the church. It was Sunday. The entire town would be there. Elias Caldwell and his father were sitting in the front pew, looking pious and powerful. The service began. The preacher droned on about honesty and truth. And then Silas stood up. The whole church went silent. "Preacher, forgive the interruption," Silas said, his voice ringing with a strength no one had ever heard from him before. "But we've been hearing a sermon about lies, and I think it's time this town heard the truth about the biggest lie of all." He held up the forged deed in one hand and the real map in the other. "The Caldwell family," he declared, his voice like thunder, "is a family of thieves." Chaos erupted. Old man Caldwell shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is an outrage, slander. Sheriff, arrest this man." The sheriff started to move, but Silas was faster. He unrolled the survey map on the pulpit, the brittle paper crackling in the stunned silence. "This is the original survey of this valley," Silas announced, his voice booming through the church. "And this," he held up the small bill of sale, "is a legal, witness document from 1866. Then he held up the grand framed deed he'd taken from the Caldwell's wall that morning. "And this is a forgery, written on paper that wasn't invented until 7 years after it was signed, with a signature traced from this very bill of sale." He laid the documents side by side. The evidence was undeniable. The traced signatures, identical down to the last quiver of the pen, were damning. A collective gasp swept through the congregation. People were standing up, craning their necks, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. All the little cruelties, the foreclosures, the quiet power plays the Caldwells had orchestrated for decades suddenly clicked into focus. It was all built on this single, monumental lie. "You're insane," Elias Caldwell shouted, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked pale, cornered. She stepped forward then, standing beside Silas. She wasn't hiding anymore. "I saw it," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the noise. "I saw the watermark on the paper with my own eyes. I heard them laughing about it, calling it the greatest story ever told." Her words, coming from the woman they had all scorned, carried an unexpected weight. The weight of truth. She wasn't just Silas's hired hand. She was the witness. The townspeople looked from the pale, sweating faces of the Caldwells to the two figures standing at the pulpit. Silas, the quiet rancher who had endured so much, and her, the woman they had all dismissed as worthless. They were an unlikely pair of saviors, but the proof they held was irrefutable. The baker's wife, Elspeth, was the first to speak. "My husband's father," she said, her voice trembling. "He always said Caldwell cheated him out of his storefront." Another man stood up. "They foreclosed on my family's farm after one bad harvest." One by one, the stories started to come out. A flood of resentment and suspicion held back for 50 years was finally unleashed. The church was no longer a place of worship. It was a courtroom, and the town was the jury. Old man Caldwell saw the tide turning. He made a desperate move. He lunged for the documents on the pulpit, aiming to destroy the evidence. But Silas was ready. He caught the old man's wrist in a grip of iron. For a moment, they were locked in a silent struggle, the old corrupt power against the new, unyielding truth. Then, with a cry of fury, Elias Caldwell pulled a small pistol from his coat pocket. He aimed it not at Silas, but at her. "It's all because of you," he screamed, his face contorted with hate. "You worthless stray, you ruined everything." But before he could pull the trigger, a blur of motion came from the side. The sheriff, his face ashen, finally chose a side. He brought the butt of his own pistol down hard on Elias's wrist. The gun clattered to the floor. It was over. The silence that followed was absolute. The Caldwells, father and son, stood defeated, exposed. Their power, built on a paper lie, had crumbled to dust in a single morning. They didn't leave town in disgrace. They were run out. The sheriff, eager to prove his newfound allegiance to the law, arrested them both. But the town's justice was swifter. Within a week, the bank was under new management, appointed by the territorial government. Mortgages were re-examined, old debts were forgiven. It was as if the whole town could finally breathe again after 50 years of being slowly suffocated. The Caldwell mansion stood empty, a monument to a fallen empire. And the quiet rancher was no longer just Silas. He was the man who had given the town its truth back. She and Silas stood on the porch of his small house, watching the sun set over the valley. The land looked different now. It looked peaceful. She had come here expecting to be a wife, and had found herself a warrior. She had expected a home, and had found a battlefield. Now, in the quiet aftermath, she wasn't sure what she had. "They're calling you a hero," she said softly. "We were heroes," he corrected, looking at her. The intensity was still in his eyes, but the hardness was gone, replaced by something warm and deep. "I couldn't have done it without you." "I just wanted to survive," she admitted. "You did more than that," he said. "You reminded me how to fight. I was close to giving up, like my wife did." He finally told her the story. His wife hadn't been able to stand the pressure, the constant threat from the Caldwells. She hadn't been strong enough for this hard land, for this silent war. She had left him years ago, returning to the city. Her departure had been the wound he'd built his silence around. "When I saw you at the station," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion, "I saw the same look in your eyes that I saw in hers the day she left, defeated. But I was wrong. The next day, I saw you walking through town, and there was no defeat in you. There was fire. I didn't want to save you. I wanted to stand next to that fire." He stepped closer, and this time the space between them held no tension, only a quiet, powerful gravity. He reached out, not to offer a hand, but to gently touch her face. His calloused thumb traced the line of her jaw. "This ranch," he said, his voice low. "This land, it's not just mine anymore. Half of it is yours, if you want it." It wasn't a proposal of marriage. It was an offer of partnership, of equality. Earned not with a dowry, but with courage and grit. She looked at his steady, honest eyes. She thought of the girl who had stepped off the train, invisible and worthless. She thought of the woman who scrubbed floors, who mended pumps, who stole evidence in the dark. She had fought for her place in this world, and she had won. "I want it," she whispered. He didn't kiss her then. He just smiled, a real slow smile that transformed his weathered face. It was a smile that promised shared sunrises and fences to mend together, and a quiet, steady strength to face whatever came next. He led her inside the small house. On the simple wooden table, 2 mugs sat waiting. Her work gloves lay beside a small carved wooden bird. Her blue ribbon was draped over the back of a chair. It wasn't a mansion built on lies. It was a home built on truth. Her home. And as she stepped across the threshold, she knew she had never needed a man to rescue her. She had only ever needed someone to see the strength that was there all along. To recognize that her calloused hands weren't a sign of what she lacked, but a testament to everything she had survived. Maybe your own hands feel rough. Maybe you've been told you're not enough, that you're too much, that you should hide the scars of your own battles. Don't listen. Your strength is not a flaw. Your resilience is not a burden. It is your crown. You are a fortress, and the world has no idea of the power you hold within your walls. Stand in your fire. Be seen, because you are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become. If this story reminded you of your own strength, don't forget to like and subscribe, because there are more stories of the strange, dark, and mysterious places where the strongest souls are forged.